Marcus had always been the type of person who questioned everything. Growing up in the lower districts of Valdoria, he watched the royal guards march through his neighborhood with their polished armor and proud expressions, treating common folk like obstacles in their path. At 25, he worked as a blacksmith's apprentice, his hands permanently stained with soot and his back aching from long hours at the forge. But what hurt more than any physical pain was the constant humiliation his people endured. The morning everything changed started like any other. Marcus was walking to work through the market square when he saw them again, 3 royal guards in their pristine blue uniforms with golden trim, their ceremonial swords gleaming at their sides. They were inspecting merchant stalls, demanding to see permits and licenses, their voices carrying the authority of the crown. Most vendors quickly complied, bowing their heads and speaking in hushed, respectful tones. But when the guards reached Elena's fruit stand, something was different. Elena was an elderly woman who had been selling apples and pears in the same spot for over 30 years. Her weathered hands told the story of a life spent in honest work, and her kind smile had brightened countless mornings for the people in the district. Today, however, that smile was nowhere to be seen. "Where is your permit, old woman?" demanded Captain Aldrich, the tallest of the 3 guards. His voice carried across the square, causing other vendors to glance nervously in their direction. Elena's voice trembled as she spoke. "Sir, I have been selling here for 30 years. My permit was always acceptable before." "Before was before," Captain Aldrich replied coldly. "The new regulations require updated documentation. Without proper papers, you cannot conduct business in royal territory." Marcus watched from across the square as Elena fumbled through a small wooden box, her hands shaking. She pulled out a yellowed piece of parchment, obviously old but carefully preserved. "This is all I have, sir. It has served me well all these years." The captain barely glanced at the document before tearing it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the suddenly quiet marketplace. "This is worthless. Pack up your goods and leave immediately, or face arrest for illegal commerce." Elena's face went pale. Marcus saw tears forming in her eyes as she looked at her life's work spread across the wooden table, bushels of carefully arranged fruit that represented her only source of income. "Please, sir, this is all I have. My grandson is sick, and I need the money for his medicine." "That is not our concern," Captain Aldrich said, his voice devoid of any compassion. "You have 5 minutes to clear out." The other 2 guards, Lieutenant Brennan and Sergeant Hayes, flanked their captain with smug expressions. They seemed to enjoy the power they held over the helpless woman. Marcus felt his anger building as he watched Elena begin to pack her fruit with trembling hands, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Other merchants and customers in the square watched in uncomfortable silence. This was not unusual behavior from the royal guards, but it never got easier to witness. The guards represented King Roderick's authority, and challenging them meant challenging the crown itself. Such defiance was considered treason, punishable by imprisonment or worse. But, as Marcus watched Elena struggle to lift a heavy crate of apples, something inside him snapped. He had seen too much cruelty, witnessed too much injustice. His feet moved before his mind could stop them, and he found himself walking directly toward the confrontation. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. The guards turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from boredom to mild irritation. "What do you want, blacksmith?" Captain Aldrich asked, recognizing Marcus's soot-stained apron. Marcus gestured toward Elena, who had stopped packing and was looking at him with wide, frightened eyes. "This woman has been serving our community faithfully for decades. Surely there must be some way to resolve this situation without destroying her livelihood." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning royal authority?" "I am questioning the humanity of your actions," Marcus replied, his voice growing stronger. "She is an elderly woman trying to make an honest living. Where is the honor in terrorizing someone who poses no threat to anyone?" A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Some people began to back away, sensing trouble brewing. Others moved closer, drawn by the rare spectacle of someone standing up to the guards. Lieutenant Brennan stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Careful, blacksmith.
Your words border on sedition.
Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew he was walking into dangerous territory, but Elena's tear-stained face gave him courage.
Sedition? For asking you to show basic human decency?
If that is sedition, then perhaps the problem lies not with my words, but with the system they describe. The crowd grew larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Marcus could see faces he recognized, neighbors, customers from the forge, fellow workers who had suffered similar humiliations at the hands of the royal guards.
Some looked at him with admiration, others with fear for his safety. Captain Aldrich's face flushed red with anger. You forget your place, commoner.
We serve at the pleasure of King Roderick himself. Our authority is absolute within these lands.
Authority without compassion is just tyranny wearing fancy clothes, Marcus shot back.
Your king may have given you power, but he did not give you the right to abuse innocent people. Sergeant Hayes laughed harshly.
Listen to the philosopher. Tell me, blacksmith, what do you know about running a kingdom? What do you understand about maintaining order among the masses?
Marcus straightened his shoulders.
I understand that true order comes from justice, not fear. I understand that a kingdom built on the suffering of its people cannot stand forever.
And I understand that men who derive pleasure from bullying the defenseless are not worthy of the uniforms they wear. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The crowd had grown silent, everyone aware that they were witnessing something that could change everything, or lead to tragedy. Elena clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, torn between gratitude for Marcus's intervention and terror at what might happen to him. Captain Aldrich drew his sword slowly, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. The sound sent a chill through the crowd, and several people gasped. You have insulted the crown, questioned royal authority, and shown contempt for the established order. These are serious crimes, blacksmith. Marcus felt his mouth go dry, but he did not back down. If speaking the truth is a crime, then your kingdom has bigger problems than one blacksmith's opinions. Kneel and beg forgiveness, the captain commanded, his sword pointing directly at Marcus's chest. Publicly apologize for your disrespect, and perhaps we will show mercy.
For a moment, Marcus wavered.
He thought about his sister Sarah, who depended on his income to support her 2 children. He thought about his dreams of someday opening his own forge, of making something of himself in this harsh world. All of that would disappear if he continued down this path. But then, he looked at Elena again, saw the hope and fear warring in her ancient eyes, and he knew he could not kneel. Not today. Not to these men who used their power to crush those who had none. I will not kneel to men who mistake cruelty for strength, Marcus said quietly, but loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. I will not apologize for defending someone who cannot defend herself. And I will not pretend that your behavior today was anything other than shameful. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Some people began to cheer quietly, while others looked around nervously, expecting royal reinforcements to arrive at any moment. Captain Aldrich's face had gone from red to purple with rage. Arrest him, the captain ordered his subordinates. Charges of sedition, public disturbance, and insulting the crown. As Lieutenant Brennan and Sergeant Hayes moved toward him, Marcus realized the full weight of what he had done. There would be no going back now. His life, as he had known it, was over. But, as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing admiration, inspiration, and hope where there had once been only resignation, he felt a strange sense of peace. Elena dropped her crate of apples and stepped forward. Please, she called out to the guards, her voice stronger now than it had been all morning. He was only trying to help me. I am the one who caused this trouble. Stay back, old woman, Captain Aldrich snapped, but something in Elena's courage seemed to spark something in the crowd. She did nothing wrong, called out Thomas the baker. Leave them both alone. This is madness, added Maria the seamstress. Since when do we arrest people for showing kindness? More voices joined in, and soon the crowd was buzzing with anger and discontent. The 3 guards found themselves facing not just one defiant blacksmith, but an entire marketplace full of people who had suddenly found their voices. Captain Aldrich looked around nervously. He had the authority to arrest Marcus, but dealing with an angry mob was beyond his orders. He had not expected this simple confrontation to escalate so quickly. "Disperse immediately," he commanded the crowd, his voice less steady than before. "Return to your business or face arrest for unlawful assembly." But the crowd did not disperse. If anything, more people were arriving, drawn by the commotion. Word was spreading through the district that someone had finally stood up to the royal guards, and people wanted to see what would happen next. Marcus found himself at the center of something much larger than he had intended. What had started as a simple attempt to help an elderly woman was becoming a symbol of resistance against years of oppression. He could see it in the faces around him, the hope, the anger, the desperate desire for change. "This is not over," Captain Aldrich said, sheathing his sword with obvious reluctance. "We know who you are, blacksmith. We know where you work, where you live. The crown has a long memory for those who defy it." Marcus met the captain's gaze steadily. "Then, remember this as well, the people of this district have longer memories for those who abuse them. And we have more reason to remember." The guards began to back away, clearly outnumbered and uncertain how to proceed. They had expected a simple morning of routine intimidation, not a public confrontation that had spiraled beyond their control. As they retreated, the crowd began to cheer. People gathered around Marcus, patting him on the back and thanking him for his courage. Elena approached him with tears in her eyes, but now they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you," she whispered, taking his sooty hands in her wrinkled ones. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth defending." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, his neighbors, his community, people he had lived among his entire life but had never really seen as potential allies. Today had changed something fundamental, not just in his own life, but in the way they all saw themselves and their place in the world. But, even as they celebrated this small victory, Marcus knew that the real consequences were yet to come. Captain Aldrich's words had not been an empty threat. The royal guards would be back, and, when they returned, they would be prepared for resistance. The question now was whether the spirit that had emerged today would survive what was certain to be a much harsher test. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the marketplace, and the entire district buzzed with nervous energy. Word of Marcus's defiance had spread far beyond the lower quarters, reaching even the noble districts where such acts of rebellion were discussed in hushed whispers behind closed doors. For the common people, however, Marcus had become something of a folk hero, the blacksmith who had dared to speak truth to power. But Marcus himself felt far from heroic as he hammered away at a horseshoe in Master Willem's forge. Each strike of his hammer echoed his growing anxiety about what was to come. He had not seen the royal guards since that morning, but their absence felt more ominous than their presence. It was like waiting for a storm when the air had grown too still and the sky too dark. Master Willem, a gruff man in his 60s who had run the forge for over 40 years, kept glancing at Marcus with a mixture of pride and worry. "You realize they will come for you," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the sound of the bellows. "Captain Aldrich is not known for forgetting slights." Marcus nodded without looking up from his work. "I know. I have been expecting them since that morning." "Then, why do you not run?" Willem asked. "You could leave tonight, travel to the eastern provinces where the king's authority is weaker. Start over somewhere they will never find you." The suggestion was not without merit. Many people who had crossed the royal guards had simply disappeared in the night, seeking refuge in distant lands where their past could not follow them. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe choice. But Marcus shook his head. "Running would prove their point, that we are powerless, that resistance is futile. Besides, where would I go? This is my home, these are my people. I will not abandon them now." Willem sighed deeply. "Your courage may be your undoing, lad." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of marching feet echoed through the narrow streets outside the forge. Both men froze, listening as the rhythmic footsteps grew louder and closer. Through the small window, Marcus could see the glint of armor and weapons in the afternoon sunlight. "Stay calm," Willem whispered, though his own voice betrayed his nervousness. "Say nothing unless they speak to you directly." The footsteps stopped directly outside their workshop. Marcus continued working, though his hands trembled slightly as he shaped the hot metal. The door burst open with a crash that sent sparks flying from the forge. Captain Aldrich entered first, flanked by not just Lieutenant Brennan and Sergeant Hayes, but 6 additional guards Marcus did not recognize. Their armor was different too, heavier, more elaborate, bearing the crimson insignia of the Royal Enforcement Division. These were not the local guards who patrolled the markets, these were the king's elite forces, sent to deal with serious threats to royal authority. Marcus Ironright, Captain Aldrich announced formally, reading from an official-looking scroll. You are hereby charged with sedition against the crown, inciting public disorder, and showing contempt for royal authority. By order of King Roderick himself, you will come with us for interrogation and sentencing. Marcus set down his hammer slowly, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone in the room could hear it. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was still shocking. The presence of the Royal Enforcement Division made it clear that his actions had drawn attention from the highest levels of government. Master Willem stepped forward, his weathered hands shaking. Please, sirs, the boy meant no real harm. He was just trying to help an old woman. Surely this matter can be resolved without involving the crown directly. Commander Thane, the leader of the Enforcement Division, turned his cold gaze on Willem. Are you questioning the judgment of His Majesty the King? No, sir, Willem replied quickly, backing away. I would never presume to do such a thing. Marcus straightened his shoulders and faced his accusers. He was terrified, but he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him cower. I am ready to face whatever charges you bring against me. How noble, Commander Thane said with obvious sarcasm. The brave blacksmith who thinks he knows better than his betters. Do you have any idea what your little performance has cost us? Marcus remained silent, sensing that any response would only make things worse. Since your pathetic display of defiance, the commander continued, we have had reports of similar incidents in 6 other districts. Merchants refusing to pay increased taxes, workers organizing protests, even some minor nobles questioning new regulations. Your little moment of heroism has inspired others to forget their place. The weight of this revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had never intended to start a wider rebellion. His actions had been spontaneous, driven by anger and compassion rather than any grand political strategy. The thought that his choices might have put other innocent people at risk filled him with guilt and dread. I acted alone, Marcus said firmly. Whatever others have done, they made their own choices. Do not punish them for my decisions. Commander Thane laughed coldly. How touching. The rebel shows concern for his fellow malcontents. Unfortunately, leadership means accepting responsibility for the consequences of your actions, intended or not. 2 of the guards moved forward and roughly grabbed Marcus by the arms. Their grip was unnecessarily tight, clearly intended to cause pain and demonstrate their power over him. Marcus winced but did not cry out. Wait, a voice called from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Elena entering the forge, followed by Thomas the baker, Maria the seamstress, and nearly a dozen other people from the marketplace. Despite their obvious fear, they stood together in the doorway, blocking the guard's path. Leave him alone, Elena said, her voice stronger than Marcus had ever heard it. He was defending me. If anyone should be arrested, it should be me for causing the trouble in the first place. We all saw what happened, Thomas added. Marcus did nothing wrong. If standing up for an elderly woman is a crime, then arrest us all. Commander Thane's expression darkened. That can certainly be arranged. Conspiracy to commit sedition is also a serious offense. The crowd behind Elena grew larger as more people arrived, drawn by word that the guards had come for Marcus. Soon the street in front of the forge was filled with concerned neighbors and supporters. Marcus watched in amazement and horror as the same spirit that had emerged in the marketplace began to manifest again, but on a larger scale. Please, Marcus called out to the crowd, his voice carrying over their angry murmurs. Go home. Do not make this worse than it already is. I chose to act, and I will face the consequences. Do not let my choices destroy your lives as well. But his words seemed to have the opposite effect.
The crowd grew more agitated, not less.
People began shouting questions at the guards, demanding to know why helping someone was considered a crime. Some began to push forward, despite the obvious danger.
Enough! Commander Thane roared, drawing his sword. The blade gleamed in the forge's fire, a deadly reminder of the power behind his authority.
Disperse immediately, or we will consider this an act of open rebellion. The crowd hesitated, caught between their desire to help Marcus and their fear of the consequences. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces, the same conflict he had faced in the marketplace, but now multiplied across dozens of people. Do not do this, Marcus pleaded with them.
I am one person. You have families, children, futures to protect.
My fate is not worth risking all of that. Elena stepped forward again, directly facing Commander Thane despite the sword in his hand.
This young man saved my livelihood and, possibly, my life.
I have lived for 73 years, and I have seen enough cruelty to know the difference between justice and oppression.
What you are doing today is not justice.
Old woman, the commander said through clenched teeth, you are walking a very dangerous path.
Perhaps, Elena replied calmly. But, at my age, some things matter more than safety.
The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus could sense that they were balanced on a knife's edge between a peaceful resolution and something much more dangerous.
One wrong word, one impulsive action, could turn this confrontation into a bloodbath.
I will come with you willingly, Marcus announced loudly, hoping to defuse the situation. But, I want your word that no one else will be harmed for what happened here today. Commander Thane studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. He had the authority to arrest everyone present, but doing so would require explanations to his superiors and might create more problems than it solved. Your cooperation is noted, the commander said finally. But, I make no promises about future consequences for those who choose to interfere with royal justice. As the guards began to lead Marcus away, the crowd parted reluctantly. He could see tears in many eyes, anger in others, and something else that both frightened and inspired him, a sense of awakening, of people beginning to question things they had always accepted as unchangeable. This is not over, Elena called after him, her voice carrying clearly in the still air.
Good people do not forget those who stand up for them.
Marcus was marched through the streets toward the Royal Detention Facility, a grim stone building that squatted like a malignant growth at the edge of the district. As they walked, he noticed something remarkable: people were following them. Not just the crowd from the forge, but others who had heard what was happening. Word was spreading faster than the guards could walk. By the time they reached the detention facility, nearly 100 people had gathered outside its gates. They did not try to stop the guards or rescue Marcus, but their presence was a powerful statement.
The blacksmith was not alone. His actions had awakened something in the community that could not be easily suppressed.
Inside the facility, Marcus was processed with brutal efficiency. His personal belongings were confiscated, his identity recorded in official documents, and he was assigned a cell number that would replace his name for the duration of his imprisonment. The guards who handled him were different from those he had encountered before, harder, more professional, completely indifferent to his humanity. His cell was small and cold, with stone walls that seemed to absorb all warmth and hope. A narrow window high above provided the only light, casting shifting patterns on the floor as clouds moved across the sun. Marcus sat on the thin straw mattress and tried to process what had happened. In the space of 3 days, his entire life had been turned upside down. He had gone from being an anonymous blacksmith to a symbol of resistance, and now to a prisoner facing charges that could result in years of imprisonment or worse. The irony was not lost on him. He had tried to help one elderly woman keep her fruit stand, and now dozens of people might face consequences for trying to help him. But, as he sat in the growing darkness, Marcus found that he did not regret his choices. For the first time in his life, he had acted according to his principles rather than his fears. He had seen what kind of man he could be when he chose courage over safety, and that knowledge could not be taken away from him, regardless of what happened next. Outside his window, he could hear voices. The crowd was still there, keeping vigil through the night. Their presence was both comforting and troubling. Comforting because it meant he was not forgotten, troubling because it suggested that his actions were continuing to inspire others to take risks. As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand something that he had not fully grasped before. Individual acts of courage, no matter how small, did not exist in isolation. They rippled outward, touching other lives, inspiring other choices, creating possibilities that had not existed before. He had thought he was simply helping Elena, but he had actually done something much more significant. He had shown an entire community that resistance was possible. The question now was whether that resistance could survive what was certain to be an increasingly harsh response from the royal authorities. Marcus had taken the first step down a dangerous path, and there was no telling where it might lead. The trial of Marcus Ironright was set to take place in the Royal Hall of Justice, a massive stone edifice that had stood for over 3 centuries as a symbol of the crown's absolute authority. The building itself was designed to intimidate, towering columns, elaborate carvings depicting the triumph of order over chaos, and windows placed so high that natural light barely reached the courtroom floor. It was here that enemies of the state were brought to face the consequences of their defiance. Marcus had been imprisoned for 2 weeks, during which time the situation in the lower districts had continued to deteriorate. What had started as a single act of compassion had somehow evolved into something the royal authorities were calling the Blacksmith Rebellion. Reports reached the prison of work stoppages, tax protests, and even some minor acts of vandalism against royal property. Each new incident was attributed to Marcus's influence, adding to the charges against him. The night before his trial, Marcus lay on his straw mattress trying to understand how everything had spiraled so far out of control. He had received no visitors, prisoners charged with sedition were kept in strict isolation, but he had heard whispers from guards about what was happening outside. The community that had rallied to support him was paying an increasingly heavy price for their loyalty. Master Willem's forge had been shut down pending an investigation into whether he had harbored seditious materials. Thomas the baker had been fined heavily for disturbing the peace during the arrest. Maria the seamstress had been forbidden from operating her business until further notice. Dozens of other people who had done nothing more than express support for Marcus were facing harassment, financial penalties, and, worse. The guilt was almost unbearable. Marcus had acted to help Elena, but his choices had brought suffering to many more people than he had ever intended to protect. He wondered if Captain Aldrich had been right. Perhaps questioning authority was a luxury that common people simply could not afford. Perhaps acceptance of injustice was a necessary price for peace. But, then, he thought of Elena's face when the guards had torn up her permit, and his resolve hardened again. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was high. The question was whether he would have the courage to maintain that conviction when facing the full power of the royal justice system. Morning came too soon. Marcus was awakened by guards who roughly pulled him from his cell and shackled his hands and feet with heavy iron chains. The message was clear: he was being treated not as a citizen accused of a crime, but as a dangerous enemy of the state who posed a threat even while bound. The walk to the courtroom took him through corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens, their painted eyes seeming to stare down at him with disapproval and contempt. Each portrait represented generations of absolute rule, of unchallenged authority, of a system that had endured for centuries precisely because people like Marcus had always been too afraid to speak against it. The courtroom itself was everything Marcus had feared it would be. The ceiling soared 3 stories above, painted with scenes of royal triumph and divine mandate. The judge's bench was elevated on a platform that required anyone addressing the court to literally look up at their betters. Guards lined the walls, their weapons clearly visible as a reminder of what happened to those who forgot their place. Judge Magistrate Cornelius Blackwood was a man in his 70s who had spent his entire career serving the crown. His face was thin and severe, his eyes cold and calculating. He had presided over hundreds of sedition trials, and his conviction rate was legendary among those who worked in the royal legal system. For Judge Blackwood, mercy was a weakness that undermined the stability of the kingdom. "The accused will stand," commanded the court clerk, a nervous young man whose voice echoed in the vast chamber. Marcus struggled to his feet, the chains making even simple movements difficult. As he rose, he became aware of something unexpected: the gallery section of the courtroom was packed with observers. Despite the obvious risks of being seen at the trial of an accused seditious, dozens of people had come to witness what happened to him. He could see Elena in the front row, her weathered face set with determination. Master Willem sat beside her, looking older and more fragile than Marcus had ever seen him. Thomas and Maria were there, along with many other faces he recognized from the marketplace and the crowd that had gathered during his arrest. Their presence was both inspiring and terrifying, inspiring because it showed their continued loyalty, terrifying because it put them all at risk of being associated with a traitor. Marcus Ironright, Judge Blackwood announced, his voice carrying easily through the cavernous room, "You stand accused of sedition against the crown, inciting public disorder, showing contempt for royal authority, and corrupting the public peace. These are serious charges that strike at the very foundation of our ordered society. How do you plead?" Marcus had been coached by the court-appointed advocate about the importance of showing proper deference to the court. A guilty plea with expressions of remorse might result in a lighter sentence. Defiance would certainly lead to the harshest possible punishment. But, as he looked out at the people who had risked their own safety to support him, Marcus knew he could not betray their faith by denying the principles that had brought them all to this moment. "I plead not guilty, Your Honor," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. A murmur rippled through the gallery, while Judge Blackwood's expression darkened with obvious displeasure. Commander Thane, serving as the primary prosecutor, smiled slightly. A guilty plea would have ended the trial quickly, but a not guilty plea would allow him to make a public example of what happened to rebels. "Very well," Judge Blackwood said coldly. "Commander Thane, present your case against the accused." What followed was a systematic destruction of Marcus's character and actions. Commander Thane painted him not as a man who had acted out of compassion, but as a dangerous radical who had deliberately sought to undermine royal authority and inspire rebellion among the masses. Every word Marcus had spoken during the confrontation with Captain Aldrich was repeated and analyzed, stripped of context and presented as evidence of treasonous intent. The accused did not simply question a policy decision, Commander Thane declared, pacing before the judge's bench with theatrical flair. He attacked the very legitimacy of royal authority itself. He called our system tyranny. He suggested that the king's appointed representatives were unworthy of their positions. He deliberately sought to inflame the passions of the crowd against the established order. Witnesses were called to testify against Marcus. Captain Aldrich took the stand and described the events in the marketplace, but his version bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. In his telling, Marcus had been aggressive and threatening from the moment he approached the guards. The crowd had been hostile and potentially violent. Elena's situation had been a minor administrative matter that Marcus had deliberately escalated into a confrontation. The accused showed complete disrespect for royal authority, Captain Aldrich testified, his voice ringing with false righteousness. He made it clear that he considered himself above the law, that he believed his personal opinions were more important than the king's commands. Such attitudes are extremely dangerous if allowed to spread among the common people. Lieutenant Brennan and Sergeant Hayes corroborated their captain's testimony, each adding their own embellishments to make Marcus seem more threatening and his actions more calculated. By the time they were finished, the man they described bore no resemblance to the frightened but determined blacksmith who had simply tried to help an elderly woman. Marcus's court-appointed advocate, a young man named David Sterling, did his best to present a defense, but he was clearly overmatched. Sterling argued that Marcus had acted impulsively out of compassion rather than any political motivation, that his words had been taken out of context, and that the response to his actions had been disproportionate to any actual threat he posed. "Your Honor," Sterling pleaded, "my client is a simple craftsman with no political education or revolutionary agenda. He saw an injustice being committed against a vulnerable person and reacted emotionally. While his methods may have been inappropriate, his intentions were honorable." But Judge Blackwood seemed unimpressed by arguments about good intentions or emotional reactions. "Mr. Sterling," the judge interrupted, "are you suggesting that good intentions justify defiance of royal authority? That emotional reactions excuse seditious behavior?" "No, Your Honor," Sterling replied quickly, "I am simply asking the court to consider the context of my client's actions and his lack of any prior criminal behavior." When it came time for witnesses to testify on Marcus's behalf, the situation became even more complicated. Elena took the stand despite obvious fear, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. Tell the court about your interaction with the defendant on the morning in question, Sterling requested gently. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper as she began to speak.
Marcus saved my livelihood, sir.
The guards were going to destroy everything I had worked for my entire life.
He stood up for me when no one else would.
Commander Thane objected immediately. Your Honor, the witness is not qualified to judge the appropriateness of official Royal Guard procedures. Sustained, Judge Blackwood ruled. The witness will confine herself to factual observations only.
Sterling tried several different approaches to get Elena's full story before the court, but each attempt was blocked by objections or judicial rulings.
The legal system was structured to give overwhelming advantage to the prosecution in cases involving royal authority, and Judge Blackwood was clearly determined to prevent any testimony that might cast the guard's actions in a negative light. When Marcus was finally called to testify on his own behalf, he faced a crucial decision. He could express remorse, claim that his actions had been a momentary lapse in judgment, and hope for mercy.
Or he could stand by his principles and accept whatever consequences followed.
Mr. Ironwright, Sterling prompted, please tell the court in your own words what happened on the morning in question. Marcus looked out at the packed gallery, seeing the faces of people who had supported him despite the risks. He thought about Elena's tears, about Master Willem's forced closure, about all the small injustices that people endured every day because they were too afraid to speak out. I saw an elderly woman being terrorized by men who abused their power, Marcus said clearly. I saw her life's work being destroyed for no good reason. I saw her dignity being stripped away by people who should have been protecting her. And I decided that I could not stand by and watch it happen.
Do you regret your actions?
Sterling asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer would not help his case. Marcus was silent for a long moment, weighing his words carefully.
I regret that my actions brought hardship to innocent people.
I regret that a simple act of kindness has been twisted into something threatening and dangerous. But I do not regret standing up for someone who could not stand up for herself. Commander Thane rose to cross-examine Marcus, and it quickly became clear that the prosecutor's goal was not to establish facts but to demonstrate the defendant's complete lack of remorse or respect for authority.
Mr. Ironwright, Thane began, his voice dripping with condescension, do you believe you are above the law?
No, sir.
Do you believe your personal opinions are more important than royal decrees?
I believe there is a difference between law and justice, sir.
Ah, Thane pounced on the answer like a predator.
So you do believe you have the right to judge royal policies and decide which ones deserve your obedience? Marcus realized he was being trapped, but he could not bring himself to deny his convictions. I believe every person has a responsibility to act according to their conscience, sir.
Even when that conscience conflicts with royal authority?
The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Marcus knew that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of everyone who had supported him. Yes, sir, he said quietly.
Even then,
The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Judge Blackwood banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, while Commander Thane smiled with obvious satisfaction. Marcus had just confessed to the very crime he was accused of, placing his personal judgment above the authority of the crown. In the gallery, Elena wept openly while Master Willem bowed his head in despair. They all understood what Marcus's answer meant. There would be no mercy, no reduced sentence, no hope for anything but the harshest possible punishment. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos like a blade.
The court will recess for 1 hour while I consider the evidence presented. The defendant will be returned to his cell until we reconvene for sentencing.
As Marcus was led away in chains, he caught one last glimpse of the people who had come to support him. Their faces showed a mixture of admiration, sorrow, and fear. He had given them truth instead of hope, principle instead of pragmatism. Whether that had been courage or foolishness, he would soon discover. The hour of recess passed like a lifetime. Marcus sat in his cell, knowing that when he returned to the courtroom, he would learn his fate. Judge Blackwood was known for harsh sentences in sedition cases, and Marcus had essentially confessed to placing his conscience above royal authority.
There could be no doubt about what was coming.
When the guards came to escort him back, Marcus noticed something different in their behavior. Instead of the usual rough handling, they seemed almost respectful, avoiding his eyes as they fastened the shackles. Word of his testimony had spread quickly through the building, and even hardened guards could recognize courage when they saw it, even if they could not openly acknowledge it. The courtroom was more crowded than before. Somehow, during the recess, even more people had found their way into the gallery. Marcus could see faces he did not recognize mixed with familiar ones. Word of the trial had spread beyond his immediate community. In the back rows, he noticed better-dressed individuals who looked like they might be from the merchant class or even minor nobility. His case had apparently attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Judge Blackwood entered with ceremonial pomp, his black robes flowing behind him like shadows of doom. The clerk called for order, and the vast room fell silent except for the echo of footsteps and the rustle of fabric. Everyone present understood they were about to witness either justice or tyranny, depending on their perspective. Marcus Ironwright, Judge Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "This court has heard extensive testimony regarding your actions and your attitude toward royal authority. Your own words have made clear that you believe personal conscience supersedes the law of the land. Such beliefs cannot be tolerated in an ordered society." Marcus stood as straight as his chains would allow, determined to face whatever came next with dignity. In the gallery, Elena clutched Master Willem's arm, her knuckles white with tension. However, Judge Blackwood continued, and the single word sent a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. "Before I pronounce sentence, this court has received a most unusual communication that must be addressed." He held up an ornate scroll with the royal seal clearly visible. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Direct communication from the palace was almost unheard of in cases like this. Usually, the king left such matters entirely to his appointed judges. His Majesty King Roderick has graciously taken personal interest in this case, Judge Blackwood announced, though his tone suggested he found the royal attention more troubling than gracious. The king has requested that certain facts be entered into the record before sentencing proceeds. A court clerk approached the bench carrying a leather portfolio filled with documents. Judge Blackwood reviewed them briefly, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "It appears," the judge said slowly, "that the royal administration has conducted its own investigation into the events that led to these charges. The findings of that investigation shed new light on the circumstances of the defendant's actions." Marcus and his advocate exchanged confused glances. Neither had been informed of any royal investigation, and such interventions were virtually unprecedented. First, Judge Blackwood read from the documents, "It has been determined that the permit regulations cited by Captain Aldrich as justification for his actions against the fruit vendor Elena Hartwell had not been properly promulgated. The supposed new requirements were part of a draft proposal that had not yet been approved by the Royal Council and, therefore, had no legal authority." A collective gasp arose from the gallery. If the regulations were not valid, then, the guards had acted without proper authority. Elena covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Judge Blackwood's voice grew more strained as he continued. "Second, investigation has revealed that Captain Aldrich has a pattern of citing non-existent or expired regulations to extort money from merchants in exchange for overlooking supposed violations. Over the past 6 months, he has collected substantial sums through such fraudulent means." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Commander Thane sat frozen at the prosecutor's table, clearly as shocked by these revelations as everyone else. Captain Aldrich was not present. According to the documents, he had been arrested 3 days ago on charges of corruption and abuse of authority. Third, the judge continued, raising his voice to be heard over the growing commotion, "The investigation has found that Lieutenant Brennan and Sergeant Hayes were aware of their captain's fraudulent activities and failed to report them as required by military regulations. They have been demoted and transferred to distant posts as punishment for their complicity." Marcus felt as though he were living in a dream. Everything he had been accused of was suddenly being reframed in light of evidence that the guards themselves had been the real criminals. But he could not understand why the king would intervene on behalf of a common blacksmith accused of sedition. Judge Blackwood set down the first set of documents and picked up another scroll, this one bearing an even more elaborate seal. "Furthermore, His Majesty has directed me to read the following statement into the record. The judge's voice took on the formal tone reserved for royal proclamations. Let it be known that the crown values the loyalty and devotion of all subjects, but such loyalty must be based on truth and justice, not blind obedience to corruption. The actions of Marcus Ironright, while technically in violation of proper procedures, were motivated by a desire to protect an innocent citizen from illegal abuse of authority. Such motivation, when proven sincere and justified, reflects the highest ideals of citizenship rather than seditious intent.
Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing.
Not only was he being vindicated, but the king himself was essentially praising his actions.
The crowd in the gallery was beyond excited now. People were standing, cheering, and calling out expressions of joy and vindication.
But Judge Blackwood was not finished. He held up his hand for silence and continued reading.
However, it must also be understood that challenging authority, even corrupt authority, cannot be done without consequence.
Order and stability require that disputes be resolved through proper channels, not public confrontation. Therefore, while Marcus Ironright's motivations are acknowledged as honorable, his methods cannot be endorsed without reservation. Marcus felt his brief hope begin to fade. Even with royal support, he was apparently still going to face punishment for his actions. Therefore, Judge Blackwood read, his voice now carrying obvious reluctance, His Majesty directs that Marcus Ironright be sentenced to 6 months of supervised service to the Crown, during which time he will assist in investigating and correcting other instances of corruption or abuse within the Royal Guard system.
His knowledge of conditions in the lower districts and his demonstrated commitment to justice will be valuable assets in this endeavor. The courtroom fell completely silent as people tried to process what they had just heard.
Marcus was not being imprisoned or executed, he was being given a position of authority in the very system he had defied. It was so unexpected that even he could not immediately grasp its implications. Furthermore, the judge continued, Elena Hartwell is to receive full compensation for the loss of income resulting from Captain Aldrich's illegal actions, and her original permit is hereby validated in perpetuity.
Master Willem's Forge will reopen immediately with an official apology from the Crown.
All fines and penalties imposed on supporters of the defendant as a result of this case are hereby rescinded. Now the celebration in the gallery could not be contained. People were on their feet, cheering, crying, embracing each other.
Elena was sobbing with relief while Master Willem looked like he could barely believe what he was hearing. Judge Blackwood banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. The court will have silence. When the noise finally died down, the judge's expression was grim despite the apparent victory for Marcus. Let me be clear about one thing, he said, his voice cutting through the lingering excitement. This outcome should not be interpreted as an endorsement of vigilante justice or civilian challenges to authority.
The circumstances of this case were exceptional due to the criminal behavior of the guards involved.
Future acts of defiance will not receive such consideration.
Marcus understood the warning, but he also understood something more important. His actions had forced the royal administration to confront corruption within its own ranks. By standing up to Captain Aldrich, he had inadvertently exposed a much larger problem that the Crown could not ignore. As the formal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Elena pushed through the crowd to reach him, her withered hands grasping his as she struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude.
You saved my life, she whispered, tears flowing freely.
But, more than that, you showed all of us that we do not have to accept cruelty as inevitable. Master Willem embraced him roughly, his gruff exterior cracking to reveal the emotional turmoil underneath.
You nearly gave me a heart attack, lad, but I have never been more proud to know someone.
As they made their way out of the courthouse, Marcus reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. In attempting to help one elderly woman, he had accidentally uncovered widespread corruption, sparked a community uprising, faced charges of sedition, and ultimately been appointed to help reform the very system he had defied. But, perhaps most importantly, he had learned something about the power of individual action. His choice to intervene in Elena's situation had been spontaneous and seemingly small, but it had created ripple effects that reached all the way to the king himself. Evil flourished when good people remained silent, but it could be challenged by anyone willing to speak truth regardless of the consequences. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to celebrate.
Street vendors were giving away food, musicians had appeared with instruments, and an impromptu festival atmosphere was developing.
For the first time in years, the people of the lower districts felt that their voices mattered, that justice was possible, that change could happen. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the celebration, and realized that while his personal ordeal was over, his real work was just beginning. As someone tasked with investigating corruption within the royal guard system, he would have the opportunity to address not just individual cases of abuse, but the underlying attitudes and practices that made such abuse possible.
It would not be easy work.
He would face resistance from entrenched interests, skepticism from both guards and citizens, and the constant challenge of creating change from within a system that had operated in certain ways for generations. But he would not be working alone. The community that had rallied to support him had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they stood together.
Elena approached him one more time before the celebration carried her away.
"What you did changed everything," she said simply.
"Not just for me, but for all of us. You showed us that we have power we never knew we had."
Marcus smiled, thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment.
We all have that power. We always did. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to use it to remind everyone else that it exists.
As evening fell and the celebration continued around him, Marcus Ironright understood that challenging the royal guards had been just the beginning. The real work, the work of building a more just society, would take a lifetime. But, for the first time since he could remember, that work felt not only possible, but inevitable. The blacksmith who had defended an elderly fruit vendor had become something he had never expected to be, a symbol of hope, a catalyst for change, and proof that even in the face of overwhelming power, individual courage could make all the difference in the world.